Many of you may have heard me talk before about the theologian Teilhard de Chardin, who said some decades ago something that I think goes along with this passage. And he said, we're not human beings on a spiritual journey. We're spiritual beings on a human journey. And somehow, I think that's what Jesus is also, and I think that's what today's two stories try to tell us about. I also think it's interesting to look at this passage and try to experience it as it felt to Jesus. That's really hard to do. I mean, people say, oh yeah, walk a mile in my shoes. Has anybody ever done that? I mean, I know some of you guys do when you dress up and you put on the heels. But I know, if you were to walk a mile, it's not just even fun, it's not real. Have you ever tried to put yourself in somebody else's place? No matter how many times people have said to us, just put yourself in my place. I've never been able to do that. I've never been able to do that. So we're going to try and do that today. He's in the middle of his ministry, and he's still trying to get some kind of space from the crowds that are pursuing him. And he enters a house, and he doesn't want anybody to know he's there. You've had that feeling, right? You go someplace, you don't want anybody to know where you are. Remember when you were a little kid you did that? We still do that, don't we? We did that selective hearing thing. It happens in our house all the time. Where are you? And there's no answer. There's just an echo of my voice. Well, we do that. But he just wants some space and some time to himself. That's all he wants. And we get that. We get that. Yet he could not escape notice. And a woman whose little daughter immediately heard about him and came and bowed down at his feet. Some theologians, this is kind of an older interpretation of this passage, will say, oh, this is Jesus is testing this woman's faith. No. The God we believe in would never wait till somebody got crushed and say, I'm just testing you. Aha. That's not what our God does. And especially, and I've not had this experience being a parent, but I cannot imagine what it's like to have a child that is so ill, there's nothing you can do except bow down at the feet of Jesus and beg him to help you. The closest I came to that experience was when I was a young person. I was in my 20s. I was actually in the convent then. And through some testing for another medical issue, it was discovered I had a large tumor on my right hip bone. And in those days, all they could do was a surgical biopsy. And today, there are much less invasive procedures. But back then, that's what they did. So I had all this crowd of nuns around me, and finally they let my mother come over. My mother had driven, early in the morning, many miles. She didn't drive. My brother drove her down. And as they were about to take me, I was fine until she bent down to talk to me. And as they were about to take me into the surgical ward, she bent down and she whispered, if I could trade places with you, I would. And that to me is the mother's love we see in this passage. I need you to help my child. I don't care what it means to me. Y'all who are parents or have been in parental roles know what I'm talking about. You know what I'm talking about. And Jesus does the human thing. Let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs. What I think he's doing here is being a rabbi of the law. That's the law. And for those of us who are rule followers or law followers, which I am, Mary will tell you, 99% of the time, unless I'm behind the wheel on an interstate. Then, forget it. But that's what he's doing. He's just being the rabbi. And I'll tell you this, you mess it up sometimes. You just mess it up sometimes as the religious leader. Something happened yesterday, and someone came to me and told me a story, and I told the person what I had seen about the story the person told me. I'm not trying to do any kind of drama here. And the person explained to me through their eyes what they had seen, which was different from what I had seen. And what I learned as the pastor was sometimes I get it wrong because I was following what had been set down as the rule we were going to follow for something. And quite honestly, generosity and compassion and grace always trump rules. And so we learn that. And Jesus is being taught that lesson by this woman. And she says, "Sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." Wow. Wow. And he gets it. He gets it. And her daughter is healed. He gets it. But he had to learn that. He had to be taught that. But did he learn it? Well, that's why we take these two stories together. The story of the Syrophoenician woman and the story of the deaf mute. Because the next time he learned the lesson and he gets it right. Now, I don't mean right in any big capital R kind of way, but he gets what his ministry is about. What I find interesting when they bring him the deaf man, and again, they beg him, just as the mother begs, they beg him to heal him, to lay his hand on him, is that when he takes him aside in private, just before he heals him, he sighs. He sighs. When do we sigh? When do we sigh? And I ponder that, and there's a lot of times we sigh. But I think that's the human part of him that sighs and then does the right thing. And then does the compassionate thing, and heals. And his ears are opened and his tongue released. Of these stories, Caroline Lewis writes, "Our God became fully human, not only for the sake of solidarity with the joys and pains of humanity, but also for the sake of telling us the truth about our humanity, which always attempts to curtail God's sovereignty." Do we, in our humanness, try to stop God from being God? That's what Caroline Lewis says. There are times we don't have that faith and allow God to be God and to trust. The first story also teaches the story about the stranger. And the stranger that we have among us. The person who is different from us comes into our midst, is joined in our journey with us, and teaches us about our world and the wonderful diversity within it, about themselves and the gift they are, created in God's image, and about ourselves. When we get to see something new, hear it in somebody else's words and voice, and begin to understand our call. Not just to tolerate diversity, and that word tolerance gets thrown around a lot. We need to be tolerant. Really? Is that all we need to be? We need to be respectful of diversity. And I think we need to be reverent of diversity. Because you are different than I. You help complete my world in a way that I can't without you being in it. Because every person in this congregation is different from the folks around them. Together, we become more completely who it is we are called to be. In both stories, there are similarities. And one of them is, in both stories, the inability to remain silent when we recognize the kingdom of God happening right here, right now, among us. When something good happens, and it's about the kingdom, it's about somebody recognizing that they are sister or brother to somebody else, that is something about which they say someplace in some book, even the stones will cry out. Because the kingdom is when we get it, that we belong to each other. We belong to each other. I was at Wawa last week. Buying Gary a sandwich. And when I came out, there was a young man, probably in his 30s, who had just gotten off a bicycle. And he was sitting, leaning against the building with, sweat dripping down his face. And he just looked tired. So I'm tooling by with Mary's sandwich. And he says, "Do you have any money I can have?" I don't usually carry money. I truly don't usually carry money. So I went to the car and I put Mary's sandwich in, and I went back to the man and said, "I want you to come inside and I will buy you lunch." He goes, no, just give me a cold sandwich, doesn't matter what it is. I said, "No, I want you to come inside and choose whatever you want for lunch." And he did. And when I went to pay for it, the person at the register said, "Oh, that was so sweet." And I thought, gee, has there been called sweet before? It's kind of like being called cute, then you should go with me. And I said to her, life is short, and we need to get that we're all connected. And I'm not telling you that story because it cost me $5 last week. I'm telling you that story because the littlest things we do, when we stop and notice somebody who's different from us, makes a difference to somebody else. It makes a difference to somebody else. Yesterday at the yard sale, there were two sisters that came in. If I get the story wrong, Jackie, fix it. And they were in the parsonage looking at the used linens. And they picked up a set of sheets somebody had donated and said, I think it was to you, was it, Jeff? And said, do you have any more? And I don't know if you found any more or not, but one of the sisters said, well, we take the sheets because we make quilts for veterans. So they looked through everything there was in that area, and this church gave the women the sheets. It's a ripple that can become an explosion of love, the tiniest things we do. A grandmother came in who was raising a granddaughter. Did not have very much money. Was told, go get whatever you need. The situation is very complicated, and I can't tell you what I know confidentially. But I will tell you that the person went and got a few things and insisted to, where's Nan? Was it Nan? Wasn't it you that she insisted that she pay you? And Nan's going, no, we're good, no. But the person in tears insisted that she wanted to make an offering. And so her granddaughter, in her arms, opened Grandma's pocketbook and took out a dime, a quarter. I don't even know what it amounted to, a little over $1. And the whole time, the woman is weeping at Nan's generosity. Now, it's not Nan and Jackie that we're talking about, just like my story in Wawa wasn't about me. It's about how we touch people, the way we're called to touch people. Caroline Lewis goes on to say, the power and possibility of the kingdom of God is even more than Jesus himself could imagine. Even more than Jesus himself could imagine. What if we let God be God? What if we open our hearts and all the creativity that exists in our minds and touched people the way Jesus touched people in these stories? Not necessarily in the first story, but in the second story, when he gets it and we get it. She says the expansiveness of God's love, God's healing, and God's grace will not be and cannot be limited. What if we really believed that? What if we really believed that what God does in our lives and the lives of other people is without limit in all the goodness that can be? And then we lived what we believe. What would that world be like? David Luce says, perhaps Jesus had not yet realized the full extent of God's mission or the radical nature of the kingdom he proclaimed. Because God's vision for the world is profoundly expansive, the notion of a kingdom that included everyone, no exceptions. Now, Scott Keir showed me a little cartoon this morning, and I'm going to mention who it was about, but it's about someone that I have trouble loving as a part of God's family. And it was actually about a preacher, I think, or people were reading the Bible, I guess, and they said, oh, we don't really believe that, we just preach that. What if we really believed it? What if we really lived it? I thought about what God's mission and vision was, and I went and I looked in our mission and vision statements one more time. I know you read them every single week, don't you? Because they're on your bulletins every single week. We said this 9 years ago. Because we believe that all are God's children, created in God's image and likeness, this is a community of and for all of God's people. Is that not the message of today's reading? We come together as that community in response to the call of faithful stewards. What does it mean to be a steward? What does that mean? We're all given gifts, and we're called to be good stewards of those gifts. Not to hoard them, but to share them. That's what stewardship is about. Faithful stewards of one another and all God has entrusted to each of us individually and all of us communally. Did you ever think about that you've been entrusted with all the gifts you've been given, whatever they are, to make sure there are no strangers here, and to be God's gift of goodness and grace and healing and compassion? Our mission statement: as a faith family of the Great Commandment. The Great Commandment, the one that includes all other commandments. And we never ever have to worry about all the ones that Moses talked about, because there's only one. There's only one. It's we love God with all of who we are. All of who we are. With every breath we take. And that we love our neighbors. Even the ones that live in D.C. and create gridlock for people trying to drive through there as ourselves. So we have to begin with loving ourselves. The Syrophoenician woman had faith in herself, loved herself enough to approach Jesus when everybody else was shooing her away. She did not allow that to happen. Our mission statement goes on to say, in the love of God, we offer sanctuary and seek to live out welcome for all without distinction. Realize God's reconciling deeds among us. Reconciling deeds. Those things that are about forgiveness. Because it's really only, for most of us, most of the time, little tiny things that annoy the crap out of us that we need to be reconciled about. And we need to think about that. Now, a whole bunch of you all were working at that yard sale for the last several days, especially the last 3. I hazard to say there were times when somebody annoyed the nonsense out of you. Were you willing to be reconciled? Were you willing to be the reconciler? At my nephew's wedding last week, imagine this. They chose 3 readings, sent me a 4th they asked me to include, and then told me to speak briefly. But in one of their readings, and I don't know why they picked this for their wedding, but they did, but in one of the readings, they picked how there is no greater love than to give one's life for a friend or for another. And I said to them, most of the time, we're not going to be in the position where we can do that. But it's the little things in life. And one of the little things I mentioned to them, and it spoke to somebody else who came and spoke to me later about it, was, who is the first after an argument to say, I forgive you? Reconcilers, not just reconciled, but reconcilers. Share our gifts to heal the world and live in love, forgiveness, and grace. If we're open to one another, when someone speaks to us and we can actually hear them and not just not hear them because we're going blah, 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 and need to say this to you when you get done talking, just hurry up and get done. We can actually hear them. Grace is ours. But we have to be open to listening to that. I have to say, one of the things I love about Scripture are the Old Testament prophets when they're not ranting and railing, telling us how bad we are and what crap's going to happen to us. Hosea, come back to me with all your heart, is one of them. Here's what Isaiah says. God will come and save you, and the eyes of the blind shall be opened, and the ears of the deaf unstopped. And the lame shall leap like a deer, the tongue of the speechless sing for joy. Can you but imagine that? If we allow God in to help us be who we're called to be. If you know someone who can't walk, what a gift to leap for joy. You know someone who can't hear, what a gift to hear a mom or dad's voice for the very first time after a cochlear implant or something. If you know someone who can't see, or is blinded by the light. Did you know, when you get cataracts, you get blinded by glare? Did you know that? Ask me. I'll tell you about it sometime. Our little dog won't go out in the morning because he goes out the front door, his cataracts blind him. But to be unblinded, to be given sight, that's what Isaiah tells us. For water shall break forth in the wilderness and streams in the desert. The burning sand shall become a pool, and the thirsty ground springs of water. I hope we become the living water that John told us about a few weeks ago. That we remain not human beings on a spiritual journey, but become spiritual beings on our human journey. Amen. Shut up, Kathy. Talk too long. Ann Barron has something she wants to share with us.